Hey, we have some really interesting results to share with you today. We're going to be asking such questions as, if Adventist schools in Australia and the Solomon Islands are financially independent of the church, does this also mean that teachers in those schools feel themselves independent of the mission of the church? You're going to find the answer interesting and, I think, a bit encouraging. We're going to ask some unexpected questions like, are the personal prayer habits of teachers in Australia different to teachers in the Solomon Islands? And that's a very interesting question when you look at the data. And furthermore, do the teachers in the Australian schools and the Solomon Island schools have different understandings of salvation? In this video, 4 members of the research team managing the Perceptions of Mission held by employees of Adventist organizations survey, bit of a mouthful, eh? Will share some of the results of their analysis of data gathered from surveys in Australia, the Solomon Islands, and North America. Join us now in a Scripture, Spirituality and Society Research Centre presentation originally given to faculty and higher degree by research students at Avondale University, together with a number of those who have a connection with the Research Centre. Hi everybody, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you here for a presentation from the Scripture, Spirituality and Society Research Centre. I think most of you know me. If you don't, my name is Rob McIver. I'm the director of the centre. We're going to be talking today about some research that we have published about a research project that we're doing for the General Conference. The research project is quite large. It involves the institutions of the church. So this is church schools, church universities, publishing centres, healthcare, hospitals. Here are the research team that is involved in this research. Today I thought I would share with you a little snippet of this larger research project associated with primary and secondary schools. So if you look there, that is a mid-year snapshot of the data collection that we have. And as you can see, the South American division, with the abbreviation SAD, has done a comprehensive survey. They have got all of their teachers, their universities, ADRA, they've got a huge television station, so they are complete. The top row is those where we have looked at schools, and again, the SAD has got the largest number of participants. We are going to be looking at the Australian Union Conference and the Solomon Islands Mission. And we're going to give you 3 short presentations, well, 4 if you count mine, looking at, first of all, the funding arrangements. And it's actually fascinating. Peter was saying it's a bald topic, but no, I think it's fascinating. Sherene is going to be talking about what teachers say that they should be doing as the mission. Wendy is going to look at a couple of matters relating to personal beliefs. And I'm going to talk about differences in practice of spirituality. And if I've got time, I've got a couple of things there that might just blow your socks off, right? It's really interesting. So let's begin with Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, hi, everyone. I said to Rob, fancy starting off with a topic of funding. I know people like Matt will be pleased to hear about this, but it wasn't my forte, but it was very interesting as I did the study anyway. I don't talk a lot about numbers, but I love stories, and I thought it's interesting that this year is the 60th anniversary on July 13, 1962, when the Catholic schools in Goulburn went on strike, shut down, said we're not operating anymore, because they were sick of having schools full of tax-paying parents who were contributing to government. They weren't getting any government funds to help run it. So one of the schools desperately needed a new toilet block. So they said the government wouldn't provide any money, so they all walked off the job. And so what happened was the Catholic schools said to the parents, send your kids to the state schools. That's where the money's going. And they knew what was going to happen because 2,000 applicants walked into the state schools where there were only 640 vacancies. And that was the beginning of the story of the government realising that they were going to have to start working out some way of funding the independent schools. So just a quick snapshot, because I only got 10 minutes, and it's a lot more complex than what I've put here, but basically the way it's worked in Australia is that if you look down the left-hand column there, it's the SES, or the socio-economic status of several different schools, and it goes from, I've just selected 5 schools at random, going from 85 for the lowest up to more than 130 for a high-class inner-city Church of England preparatory school. That's the SES score. The more affluent the school is, the less the government would provide the funding for the operation of the school. And basically, apart from donations and old boys stuff that's given in, the schools only have 2 sources of income, and that was the government or the school fees. So the more affluent the school, the less money from the government, the more school fees, etc. We've all heard about the Gonski report, Gonski 1 and 2, that's come in over the last decade, and so much was introduced here, but I've just summarised here. And there's been adjustments for students with special needs in schools, multicultural students, English as second language students, etc. Basically, when I analysed it, SDA schools spend their money from the government on wages. This is a very broad generalisation, but it's an average sort of a thing. And that's 60% of their budget. The other 40% on other things comes from school fees. Now, there's been debates in Australia for many years over the divide between the independent sector and public education. The supporters of public education look at the facilities that private schools, independent schools have had, and have said, you know, this is an elitist thing going on here. And surely if you went along the Pacific Highway in North Shore and looked at Abbotsleigh or Knox College or some of the facilities they've got, you'd understand why they say it. But a lot of that is coming from donations of very wealthy old boys, and it's not actually the government that is providing that. So when you look back at the history, the funding of Adventist schools was a fairly contentious issue back in the day when we first started receiving funding from the government. And you'll see in 1984, Standish and Standish said there was a time when Seventh-day Adventist schools stood staunchly against public funding of education. But if we look at the history of what happened after the funding, after Adventist schools started to get funded, and you look at where schools are now, schools have mostly the largest budgets in conferences compared to the church operations. They have the greatest workforce, and it may be debatable, but coming from an education area, I would say the premier means of evangelism coming from schools, and obviously providing less financial burden on conferences and individual churches who used to contribute. And why not take the money? Mrs. White says we need not sacrifice one principle of truth while taking advantage of every opportunity to advance the cause of God. Moving on to the Solomon Islands, I thought this was an interesting graph that I was able to compile, looking at the history of the different churches that provide Christian education or independent education in the Solomon Islands. And it's nice to look at that Adventist one, isn't it? Not only to see that it's the highest number of schools, population of students, but that it's had a steady growth where others have declined over the years. And that was as of 2017, the yellow bar at the end. So this was also contentious. Other schools were receiving money from the government to pay their teachers. Adventist schools weren't. Dr. Ray Wilkinson, Gwen's dad, who was here. He was the one who worked with the Western Pacific Union Mission and the government to have Adventist teachers paid by the government in Adventist schools. But what they were wanting was that the union would receive a bulk amount of money and then they would distribute it to the teachers in the schools. Whereas the other schools were actually, the teachers were being paid directly from the government payroll. So the Adventists wanted to keep it as a bulk thing so they could maintain control or authority. Funny about that. In any case, there were church employees, there were senior people in the church system who were very worried about losing authority and control over the schools by having this funding arranged, but the bulk funding was arranged in the end until the ethnic strife that occurred in the Solomon Islands, and those bulk payments ceased. And it was a crisis time because if the church wasn't receiving the bulk payment, they couldn't distribute it to the teachers. After a lot of toing and froing, it ended up that in the end, schools, or the teachers in Adventist schools, were paid directly from the government because of the cessation of that bulk payment. That's how it happened in the Solomon Islands. In summary, this is my 44th year in Adventist education. I've worked in the Solomon Islands, I've worked in multiple schools in Australia, and all I can say is the government funding of schools, and in New Zealand, the same thing, the government funding of schools has done nothing for Adventist schools except benefit them to increase their clientele and to create much more of an evangelistic centre out of schools.
Were you like me in finding the funding of the Adventist school systems more interesting than you expected? I was very interested to see how the school systems in Australia and the Solomon Islands took different paths, but they both ended up being funded largely from government sources and fees. This raises the question, if the schools are financially independent of the church, does this mean their teachers feel independent of the mission of the church? Sherene Hattingh is going to address that question in her presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My part and I'm loving being part of this research team, and I'm going to report back on some of the qualitative data from Australia and the Solomon Islands. I love analysing what people are saying, and so as part of the survey, the participants needed to answer some open-ended questions. And so I've looked at two of those questions, and I'm going to report back on those. So these are the two questions I'm going to focus in on. The first one was, I work at a church-centred connected school. If I were asked what the mission of my school should be, I would say, and open-ended, so they could use their own words. And the other question I looked at is, my organisation is owned by or connected to the Seventh Adventist Church. If I was asked what makes it different from similar organisations that are not part of the Seventh Adventist Church, I would say. So you could imagine the kind of information that we received asking this. Now, that first question was number 1 on the survey, and the second question was number 3 on the survey. So it happened right near the start, when people were hopefully much more enthusiastic to write something in those spaces. So looking at this first question, which is really around what do I think the mission of my school should be? And so open-ended, what do our teachers think? So having a look at the Australian data, and this was from 519 participants, what did they think the mission of their school should be? And if you have a look at that, 135 of the participants said the mission should be what they do in their work for, which is education. And so that should be the mission of the school. The second one that came up, so finding these themes, they used thematic analysis. Looking for the themes was really looking at what the participants are saying and then using their words. So these were not themes I came up with, these were the themes that came from the data. And so taking out what most of the participants were talking about. The second one that came up was sharing the good news. Now, isn't that encouraging? Our teachers think that the mission of our schools should be to share the good news and then leading others to Jesus. And I've separated and kept those in different themes because the teachers used different words to articulate this. And so it was important to keep it separate, and you'll see why later on when I share some other information. They spoke about it being, it should be about having a Christian environment. It should be about representing God to others, helping in becoming good citizens for our students, and then preparation for eternal life, and then service. And that service element of being service to my community. So really interesting in how they articulated the words through. Having a look at the same question, but with the data from the Solomon Islands. This is from 313 participants. And look at the first one that came up. What do they think the mission of our school should be? Preparing for eternity. And then teaching the good news. See where work falls in? And I'll show you back and show you a comparative slide shortly about what the Australian data showed compared to Solomon Island data and some other data. But do you see the difference in order there? Very interesting. I'm just going to go back one slide quickly. See the last theme. This is still in question 1 with the Australian data. Do you see 94 participants actually didn't write anything in what they think the mission of the school should be? Keep that in the back of your mind as we continue. Look at the Solomon Islands, okay? Very few that didn't fill it in. Most of them filled that space in, so only 7 of them. But you will notice in there, I did put a theme that says misunderstood the question. There were some interesting responses in there. It was still a response, but it didn't address what the question asked. So I needed to include that as a theme in there. So just interesting to look at the themes that jumped out and emerged from that data. Now if we look at the second question, which was, what makes this institute different to another similar institute? So interesting the themes that came out of this. So from the Australian data, what makes us different? We're Christ-centered. We have special character. We have a Seventh-day Adventist focus. We have a nurturing environment. Our staff commitment to the organisation. We are biblically based. Look at this one. There is no difference. And then the one that really, really jumped out at me, look at the no response. That for me was huge. I have more questions, and Rob and I have discussed this. Why is there no response? That's another whole survey to ask the participants about, but that was something that was quite interesting. Look at the Solomon Island data for the same question. So what makes us different? Biblically based organisation. Seventh-day Adventist focus. We're future focused. Our lifestyle and our way of living. Nurturing environment. So you've seen some of the common themes that run across the Australian data and the Solomon Island data. Staff commitment to the organisation and mission. Private independent organisation, non-government, and you heard some of that from Peter and what he shared, and additional Christian-focused activities. And then no response. Only 12 didn't answer the question. And then only 5 said there's nothing really different. So quite different in the data there. The next slide I'm going to show you, I hope it blows you away. I am a colour person, not that it's so busy, but from the aspect of looking at similar themes, and I've actually included the data from the North America division, what the teachers responded and what they responded, because we're presenting on the South Pacific data, but I wanted to include it there so that you can see across our schools in the South Pacific division and the North America division, some of the themes are correspondingly across, but not necessarily in the same order. So what I've done across them is I've color-coded them to help you. I'm a visual person, and I like to see color. So you'll see where I've got the work education, there is a match across. So the third one down on the Solomon Islands matches that, and the second one down on the North America teachers' results. So looking across there, you can see that the main focus still needs to be around sharing the good news. Falls across all of them. Leading others to Jesus still sits there. And you can see the ones that the service learning is in the Australian themes and in the North America theme. So I found that quite interesting. But part of the data that jumps out for me in this space sits around the no responses. I don't know if you're starting to notice something that's coming out about no responses. The Australians are still high in the no response rate. That still sits there, piquing my interest. Now, let's have a look at the results across from, so what should the mission of my school be? Now, if we look at what makes us different, this is the part that jumps up for me. What makes us different? For the Australians, the highest one was nothing, because they didn't answer the question. And then around Christ-centered. Do you see that almost all across? Christ-centered is what makes us different. Look at our Seventh-day Adventist focus. I'll put it in lime green, obvious reasons. Look at the special character. And then we've got that nurturing environment, and then the staff commitment. For me, that was really encouraging to know that across our schools, we have staff who are focused, who know and can see what makes us different to other institutions. So I hope that encourages you guys to see the data coming through from our schools, but also including some of the North American data.
Well, as you will see from my title, I'm actually sharing data from the study from the North American division. I have actually also collected data from Australia and the Solomon Islands, but have not presented that so far. But what you're going to find is what I present here today, the beliefs about personal salvation held by primary and secondary teachers in North America, is very similar to what we find in Australia, although somewhat different from what we found in the Solomon Islands. And I'm starting here, I want to give you just a little bit of background of why we even want to talk about this. And part of the background is that we are somewhat diverse in our roots and somewhat diverse in terms of some of the activities and factors that have come to play in our background. And as Seventh-day Adventists, our most immediate theological background comes from Methodism. And so there are a couple of contributors to our understanding of salvation that come from Methodism. The first of those being our Arminian background, which I'll come back to in just a moment, and the second being an emphasis on holiness. Now, for those of you who don't have a theological background, Protestant understandings of salvation are generally divided into two groups, Arminianism and Calvinism. And I'm going to paint in very broad strokes here because there are quite a few nuances around it. But in broad strokes, an Arminian says salvation is available to anybody who accepts Jesus Christ. That we have free will, that while we are deeply sinful, God extends grace to us and we have free will enough to choose salvation. On the other hand, Calvinists believe that we are so depraved that we cannot make any choices ourselves. And therefore God predestines or determines in advance who is going to be saved and who is not. And God's will cannot be resisted. So whatever He's chosen, we cannot argue against that. So our Adventist background is one that comes from Arminianism rather than Calvinism. Now, why is that important? That's important because of the free will component. And so there's this question, can we possibly have assurance of salvation if there is a free will component as part of this? Now, the second thing that comes into play around free will and around the idea of assurance is the Adventist doctrine of the investigative judgment. And some forms of understandings around the investigative judgment also would make it very difficult for us to have some assurance of salvation. Now, the other thing that I think is really important when we think about the diversity of understanding of salvation is that we, over our life as a church, have wrestled with the role of law and grace. And you might recall that in our earliest days, we were very legalistic, those of you who remember some of your Adventist church history, that we emphasized the eternal law, particularly in relation to the Sabbath. And it wasn't until we became a little bit more mature as a church that there was suddenly this understanding that perhaps we had lost some of the understanding of grace and the role of faith. And this wrestling has continued throughout the history of the Adventist church. And because of this, we were expecting there may be some concerns around how people understood the role of law and grace. And there's a lot more we could say about this in background, but we don't have the time today. But just wanted to flag you that there are two areas that we're expecting there might be a problem: assurance of salvation and the role of the law. Now, like my colleagues, this is part of this bigger funded study that Rob has shown you the big picture earlier today, funded through Archives and Statistics research, and we're looking at these two big figures, big ideas of how institutional workers see their own work in relation to the mission of the Adventist Church and the work of their institution, and Sherene has already talked about some of that. But their understanding of salvation is also important, because how they understand salvation will also have an impact on how they share the gospel and the way that they actually do mission. Now, I've just put this slide on here for one reason, just to show you that the questions that I am answering out of this big survey come in two branches, branch C and branch E. And the numbers are a little bit smaller because people did a variety of different branches, and these questions are not in all branches of the survey. So what is it we were asking of them about salvation? Well, one question asked whether they agreed or disagreed with a number of statements. And I've only picked out the ones related to salvation here. So if you're wondering why the numbering doesn't go A, B, C, it's because I've just picked out the statements that have to do with salvation in some way. But you can see some interesting ones to try and weed out some of these different ideas about salvation. I should be right in the end if I'm a morally good person. I believe in a personal God who seeks a relationship with human beings. I will make it to heaven only if I have a personal relationship with Jesus. Christianity is about Jesus giving me power to live a righteous life. I'm saved the moment that I believe and accept Jesus, what Jesus has done for me. I won't get to heaven unless I obey God's law. There are clear and absolute standards for what is right and wrong. I can only be saved through the church. When you get right down to it, there are only two kinds of people in the world, and I'm sorry I can't see the rest of the question underneath this bar. Give me 1 second. Yeah, the righteous who will be rewarded by God, and that's the last one on there, right? So there's a number of statements, and all they're doing is marking on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now, in addition to that, we ask, which of the following statements is something you would say in answer to the question, are you saved? Yes, maybe, no. By God's grace, I've been saved and being saved and will be saved. I haven't really thought about the question before, or there was a space for an open response. And then, what was your reaction when you were asked this question? I don't think it's anyone else's business, through to it's too complicated for a yes or no answer. Well, let me just give you slight demographic information, seeing this is outside of our own division. Unlike Australia and New Zealand, where we have about 2/3 of our teachers as male, in North America about 2/3 are female. So we have a slightly different variation here. 100% identified as Seventh-day Adventists. Most had a membership in their local church that was current. But look at the age. 95% had been members for greater than 16 years. So you can already see this is an older group of people. And then 90% attend church services at least once a week, with another 8% at least once a month. So you've got a group who are very heavily committed to the church by these set of measures. So what did we find? Well, let's have a quick look here. Christianity is about Jesus giving me the power to live a righteous life. Now, this is an interesting question because in the Pacific, right, we're expecting in animistic cultures and in Pacific cultures that power is going to be really high on the scale. But even here in North America, we've got nearly 50% who strongly agree that the whole purpose here of Christianity is about giving me a power to live a righteous life. Now, if you compare that to the Pacific, and we have Solomon Island statistics, that goes way up to about 75%. But this is very similar to the Australian breakdown here in the North American data. Now, this one interests me particularly. If I'm a morally good person, I should be all right in the end. The focus here is on behaviour rather than relationship. And notice that a full quarter of the respondents here agree or strongly agree that if they're morally good, I should be right in the end. And again, in Australian data, very similar. In fact, I think it might have gone even slightly higher to 30-something%. So there is this kind of thinking that maybe what I do is perhaps more important than who I am and my relationship with Christ. I will make it to heaven only if I have a personal relationship with Jesus. This one I'm concerned about, in that you've got nearly 10% that say no. But then I went, well, perhaps they're thinking about people in the Old Testament who didn't know Jesus, so perhaps they'll be thinking through this a little bit more than I thought. But you can see only about 2/3 strongly agree here that I will make it to heaven only if I have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm saved the moment that I believe and accept what Jesus has done for me. Again, 20% who are not strongly agreeing with this particular statement, which just it raises some really big questions in my head about what is it we're actually teaching our children about salvation. I will not get to heaven unless I obey God's law. And notice how interesting this kind of almost a normal distribution across here, that it's not, we don't have it kind of sticking out in one particular area. And this to me suggests this confusion that's happening over what role does the law actually play in relation to my salvation, right? So you have about 1/3 who disagree, about 1/3 who agree more than disagree, and then about 1/3 who strongly agree. So quite an interesting mix here. There are clear and absolute standards about what is right or wrong. And again, we've got only about 45% who agree that there are some very clear and absolute standards about what is right or wrong, with another 40% hedging their bets a little bit. Yeah, a little bit more than not. I can only be saved through the church. I was delighted to see that almost everybody said that I did not have to be saved through the church. So we've done some good messaging on this one, but not so good on some of the other things, as you've seen. There are only two kinds of people in the world, the righteous who will be rewarded by God and the rest who will not. Again, there was a bit of equivocation happening here. You can see only about 50% strongly agree, and a bit of a spread across the rest. When asked, are you saved? You can see about a quarter said yes. And then almost all the rest kind of went into that tentative one. By God's grace, I have been saved, I am being saved, will be saved, with some maybes, and then other, whatever might fit in that other, maybe no. And the reaction to being asked this question, for the most part, about half said it was okay. Some were pleased to be asked, but you can see that some felt uncomfortable, and others didn't think it was anybody else's business at all. So what? So let's kind of summarise those things. Well, nearly 25% indicate that salvation is likely if they are morally good. That is, there's this emphasis of lifestyle over relationship. There's clearly a confusion about the role of the law in relation to salvation. And while there is this idea of personal relationship is exciting, and most people saw that was important, 10% either didn't believe it, didn't think it was necessary, or didn't know. And about 8% didn't believe or didn't know that they were saved on acceptance of Jesus Christ and what he has done for us. The great majority had this tentative response to whether or not they are saved. And so I'm left with these implications. Students are likely to receive mixed messages about the role of the law and behaviour in relation to salvation, and therefore there's a potential risk that the role of grace will be lost because of these confused messages. It's unlikely that students will be taught that they can have assurance of salvation when nearly 3/4 of them were not willing to go, yes, I am saved. And opportunities for mission might be overlooked due to the reluctance to see humanity as having righteous and unrighteous groups. Thank you very much.
As you can see, we've got a really interesting data set there. You can look at all kinds of things. Listen to Sherry. Again, this is what impresses me about the survey results that we're getting back from teachers and other people working in institutions of the Adventist Church. They're really committed to the mission. I mean, it's really, really encouraging. Wendy pointed out, and I think it was Sherene as well, that they live exemplary personal lives. What I have here is a couple of interesting comparisons. When we were working on this book, we had the 3 data sets available to us, the Australian data and the North American division data. We had some other data as well, but we thought it would be interesting to do one publication for the North American data and one publication for the South Pacific data, with a few comparisons. If you look at the age profile of the North American division is skewed towards the much older group. The age profile of Australia is pretty constant right across the groups. There's people representing numbers from each age range. And the Solomon Islands group is very, very young. And also, in America, you've got most people would have a master's and a few PhDs. In the Australian context, at least a bachelor's, and a lot of them are working on masters. And in the Solomon Islands, this is something that the division is very much aware of. They have got a long way to go in upgrading the qualifications of their teachers. What you do is when you get a data set, you try and run comparisons to see if there are statistically significant differences. And here are the items, well, not the entire set of items, but here are some interesting items where there were some statistically significant differences between the responses from the Australians and the responses from the Solomon Islands. Now, the Solomon Islands culture is Melanesian. I think it's fair to describe them as still being in a developing circumstance. Some of the islands don't have telephones. They're reliant on radio, intermittent radio connections, for example. So the people that came in to do the survey, some of them had quite exciting journeys to make it there. So we have Melanesian culture. We have quite a distinctive set of people who have got a different background to the people who are working in the Australian Adventist schools. The curious thing is, we're Adventists, we're recognisably the same, right? It's not every item where there was dramatic differences. There were only some items, but here they were. One of them was pray outside attending the religious service. So if you look at that, you will see that Australian teachers, by and large, pray once a day or more. But look there for the Solomon Islands. Wow. What's going on here? Because what strikes me is when you visit the Solomon Islands, they are full on. They are really spiritual people. And it's only by luck that we also asked a question which says, do you attend a prayer meeting regularly? and because it was in that prayer meeting, we were thinking once a week. But a large group of the folks in the Solomon Islands attend prayer meetings once a day or more. So it is a group culture worshipping together as a group rather than an individual spirituality, which I thought was quite remarkable. Here is the one that Wendy was talking about. Christianity is about Jesus giving me power to live the righteous life, and I shall be all right in the end if I'm a morally good person. And so, yes, well, this is not unexpected. There is a significant group of islanders in our theology program, Polynesians as well as Melanesians, and in both groups, when you listen to their prayers and you listen to them talking about what Christianity means for them, power is a term that keeps coming up over and over again. So power is something that is important to people who are teaching in Adventist schools in the Solomon Islands. It's also important to teachers in Australia. And if you read your New Testament, you'll also find some evidence in the New Testament that the early church was also concerned with power. But there's a bit more of an emphasis on it in the Solomon Islands. Now, here is the absolutely fascinating question. I believe the world is millions of years old. Now, I'm going to take that graph off the screen. What would you guess, right? Amongst the Australian teachers, do you think there would be more Australian teachers that would say the world is millions of years old? Or amongst the Solomon Island teachers who say the world is millions of years old, right? Creationism is a very sensitive topic in Adventism. There are currently 28 fundamental beliefs. They have changed the wording on the creation question twice. And there's still an enormous amount of debate in the Adventist Church on how we should understand creation. So, which would you think would have the more scientifically informed group, who are more likely to say the world is millions of years old? Well, can you see that little tiny graph there? The people that are more likely to agree are from the Solomon Islands. Isn't that interesting? And it is actually a very small percentage of the Adventist teachers in Australian schools who believe the world is millions of years old. Now, I found both of those bits of data kind of interesting. The people who had worked in New Guinea tell me that Melanesian culture thinks the world is old. And I happen to be playing golf with 3 people in the following week after looking at this data. And one of them was a student from the Solomon Islands that had come as an adult to Australia. One of them was a businessman currently working in New Guinea, a local New Guinean. And the other one, yes, had come from New Guinea and studied in Australia and then at Avondale and graduated theology from our program. And they said, sure, Rob, in our culture, the world's just old. So, isn't that interesting? All right, so what am I going to conclude here? I'm going to conclude there are 2 great books if you don't have already in your library. I'd like you to at least consider them, well, at least knowing about them. So that's really great. And as I've said a couple of times already, I am just blown away by the fact that our workers in Adventist institutions, schools, universities, in the whole range of institutions that we work, are so focused on the mission of the church and see what they do in their role as furthering the mission of the Seventh Adventist Church. I trust that you've enjoyed this presentation of the Scripture, Spirituality and Society Research Centre at Avondale University. I would like to thank my fellow presenters, Peter Kilgour, Sherene Hattingh and Wendy Jackson, for their help in this presentation and their help in writing up and presenting the results of our research together. From time to time, the Research Centre hosts research presentations, and if you would like to be notified of the next time one appears as a video, why don't you click on the subscribe button below and also choose the notification bell. This is Rob McIver, Director of the Centre. I look forward to meeting with you on the next occasion. Thank you.